Welcome into the ArtGibbs Sports Business Podcast. Thank you so much for joining us. And in this episode, we're going to be talking about winning with technology, specifically in the Milan San Remo race of 2022, where Matej Mohoric utilized new technology to win the race. All right, so for those that don't know, Milan San Remo is a cycling race. It's a prestigious one-day race, i.e. not a Tour of France, Tour of Spain, Pyrenees, those kinds of things. But it's a one-day race. It's a race generally where the sprinters can have their day, although there are some hills, and it's an extremely long day. I believe it's the longest cycling classic by distance in the entire race calendar, coming in at just over 185 miles of racing. Now, the race goes throughout Italy, goes up several climbs, lumpy climbs towards the end of the race, culminating with a very fast climb up the Poggio. It's a not too steep of a climb, but the riders create massive power going up this short climb. Then there's a descent down, a winding descent into the last 10K or so of flat riding. Most of the time, the decisive victory is made on the Poggio, or at least a decisive attack that brings that group down to a few riders. In this case, this most recent race in 2022, there was many attacks going up the Poggio, as there always are. This year, probably more than any. And then coming over the top in fifth place was the eventual winner, Matej Mohoric. He's a Slovenian, just like the great Primož Roglic, just like two-time Tour winner. So he goes over in fifth place. Now all that's left is a descent and then into the flats. So we're assuming at that point, most cycling fans are assuming at that point that we're going to have some type of group, 2, 3, 4, 5 riders to some degree coming to the line. Maybe somebody sprints out late, brings it to a group of 3, something like that. Someone drops off. But roughly that kind of a race scenario is normally what plays out at that point if you have so many people within a couple seconds of each other going over the Poggio, the top of the Poggio. In this case, we saw Matej Mohoric pass those riders, storm down the descent, almost crash several times, ride away to victory alone, and win. Now, he's a very strong rider. He won, I think it was 2 stages of the Tour, this most recent iteration of the Tour de France. So he's a very high-end rider. Rides for Bahrain Victorious. And it looked like he just did a daring descent, rode away from everyone, and won the race. Which he did. He did do that. But then we find out afterward that he used a dropper post. Now, luckily, Mohoric was more than willing to discuss what he used, how he used it, what brand he used, and what he thinks will be the result of this going forward in cycling. So we've got a lot to dig into. So let me just quickly go over this. And I'm not the only one to do this. Stephen Ferrand wrote a great article in Cycling News, but again, most of this is quoted directly from Mohoric after the race. So now Bahrain Victorious has a smattering of sponsors, just like all these other top cycling, pro tour cycling teams. And their bike sponsor is, of course, Meridia. And they also have a sponsor, FSA, who does make a dropper post. But in this case, according to Mohoric, this was the Fox Transfer SL Performance Elite dropper post, which incredibly is still available online on most websites, even to this date. But it's a carbon fiber piece, touted as the lightest piece on the market, and it is a dropper post, meaning that it can go up and down, mostly used on mountain bikes, and it provides more control. It allows you to kind of get the saddle out of the way. It allows you to sit on a lower saddle and pedal, all of that kind of stuff. They weren't really used in cycling on the road until, of course, in a big way today. Now, the UCI rules do allow for a dropper post. It just has to be a dropper post that's commercially available. Just like by the way, just like all of the UCI rules on technology, it's got to be commercially available. Now, there are some exceptions, i.e., it can become commercially available within 12 months, but it still has to be approved by the UCI. There's some prototype exceptions that can be made, but basically the idea is that if everybody competing can't get it, you can't use it. You can't tape stuff on. You can't put carbon fiber wings on if it's not available. Commercially, none of that. So, same in this case. They had to use a dropper post that was commercially available. And most mountain bikes, they have a circular tube for the seat post. Many of the road bikes nowadays, you'll notice, have a more aero seat post. So the seat post along with that down tube is kind of a aerodynamic D shape, I guess people say, but kind of flat at the front and then widening off to the sides, which, is more aerodynamic than a circle and has less, drag coming out the back. Now, Meridia, luckily, still had the circular seat post that allowed Mohoric to use a mountain bike seat post that was commercially available, put it on his bike, use it in the race. Now, interestingly enough, number one, this was allowed by the UCI rules, but also Mohoric, at least according to him, he went around early in the race and showed, the other favorites that he knew. He showed him the dropper post. And I just have a quote here from him. He said, "I was going around to the race favorites I know and showing off the dropper. They asked me what I was doing with a dropper and laughed, but I warned them if they follow me on the descent, it's at their own risk," which of course we saw him descending was kind of at his own risk. There were a couple close calls here, but it did work, and it was a daring descent and really put in a fair amount of time that against the other rivals, even on that short descent. Now, of course, the super tuck, which got outlawed, which was basically putting your butt, for lack of a better term, on the top bar of the bike, totally going below the seat and pedaling from that position to be more aero, to have a lower center of gravity, and to still be able to pedal. The UCI thought it was too dangerous. They banned the super tuck. Mohoric was a big user of the super tuck. And effectively, the drop post is basically a safer way to do the super tuck. You're getting lower. You're getting a lower center of gravity. You're still able to pedal, make power, brake, all from that position as you're going downhill. Now, it is interesting, and even Mohoric in his words mentions this, that, it's like Formula One. It's kind of a technical arms race. And you don't tend to think about that in cycling, but I think recently, especially, we're seeing it in cycling. We're seeing it in running. Nike's, breaking the 2-hour barrier in the marathon. They use wind tunnel testing on the pacers. They have carbon fiber pads within the shoes that create, basically better energy recovery on foot strike. And you're seeing it, of course, in cycling. I mean, it's always been the case, but now I think it's really coming out where, many of the training methods are shared among top riders. There's a lot of money in the sport, so access to altitude tents and that kind of stuff is very readily available for many of the athletes. And so it does come down to some of these technological advances on the bike, in the helmets, in the glasses. And it's good for the sport in a couple ways, right? Like it keeps everybody pushing forward. It keeps the technology pushing forward, and it makes better products for the everyday runner, the everyday rider. And of course, from the sports perspective and from the sponsor's perspective, it creates demand for new products. So you watch a race and you can see the Mohoric uses the dropper tube, run out to your local store and get it. You can see that people are using disc brakes, you run out to your local store and get it. That's important. It's important to drive value into the sport, into the sponsors, and ultimately to the athletes themselves. And I think we're seeing it more and more. Again, Formula One is famous for this, the technical arms race. But I think now we're going to see it more and more in cycling, where the envelope's being pushed, the materials are being pushed, and it feels like we're really on an upward trend of technological influence. We'll see how the UCI responds to that. But of course, one of the last major advancements we saw was, Greg LeMond and the aero bars. Nowadays, we're seeing the disc brakes, we're seeing the dropper post, and we're seeing some, really new materials. Obviously, carbon fiber was a big move up, and most likely graphene to some degree is going to be used as well. And it's a really interesting time. So we'll see what the next technology is. And just like new training methods and just like the brutal races, which are so common in cycling, now another thing to watch out for is the new technologies that are sure to come up in races going forward. Thank you for this quick look at Mohoric, the dropper tube, and the victory in Milan San Remo. Thank you.